The very processes that make us so adaptive, those very processes also make us perpetually prone to self-deception.
In a city bereft of virtue, it's almost impossible for the philosopher to be born.
Thoreau says, it takes a lifetime to learn how to live.
These are icons of the highest goods, but they're made present in just the ordinary moments of the everyday, the extraordinary in the ordinary.
It's a big issue, what makes a human life meaningful.
Oh dear diorama, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh dear diorama, tell me why is the good never good enough? Underneath the dirt and scar is an old and familiar face.
Well, welcome back to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. I'm amazingly excited to have Professor John Vervaeke with us from the University of Toronto, widely popular for addressing what Charles Taylor called the great dismemberment, right? Or the crisis of meaning that I think many of us are experiencing in our day-to-day lives these days. And so I'm very excited to have him on because not only does he have a 50-part lecture series on this particular subject, but he also has a book that kind of diagnoses the problem with others of the kind of draining zombie-like culture that we are currently existing in. And one of the things I really want to ask as a Platonist is, how is it that ancient mystery and philosophical traditions, as well as Platonism in particular, how is it that they are essential or integral to how you address this problem in our society?
Yeah, so Danny, that is the question for me in a lot of ways. I have about 3 or 4 major questions, and that's one of them continuously. And I think it's in alignment with like your project, Charles's project about Platonism as a living tradition. So I want to start at one point, which is our culture has decided to do something since the advent of modernity, the European Enlightenment. I mean, all the R's: the Renaissance, the Protestant Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution. Since all the R's, we've endeavored to do this very odd thing, culturally and historically. We have separated the meaning project from the wisdom project. And this is now endemic even in the academic study of meaning in life, which is actually a flourishing industry within cognitive science and psychology. It's a big issue, what makes a human life meaningful. And by that, I don't mean that you're content, that's subjective well-being, or you feel empowered, that's mastery and all that stuff. What I mean is, what is it that makes your life worth living, even when you fail, even when you're frustrated, even when your finitude and your fate gnaw into you, all those things. What preserves you from despair in the face of tragedy? Well, I'm just giving that intuitive notion. We can get into it more deeply, but what we have, I think, devolved to, and this is sort of a result of some historical forces, is the notion of meaning as a personal, private possession of that is largely driven by my preferences that result in certain forms of pleasure for me, and that has no concern for the some fundamental features of meaning. This is a critique that Arjun Arora and I have been making. That meaning is ultimately not just a descriptive term. It is a thick term. It is also a normative term. It is a term of praise and evaluation and recommendation. If I say Rob has a really meaningful life, I'm recommending his life, that you should consider it. Think of it. It might be something you measure your own life against, etc. And that normative dimension is there because, of course, um, meaning has to be mutually created and corrected between us, and because of the fact that the very machinery that gives us the connectedness that's at the heart of meaning also makes us prone to self-deception, which can undermine that connectedness profoundly and render us subject to absurdity, alienation, anguish, things like that. So our culture has separated uh, the cultivation of wisdom, which I'll just gloss here. Again, this is something I hope we go into detail, but wisdom is at least this. It's probably much more, but it's at least this: the reliable ability to systemically within your system and systematically throughout your life reduce self deception, afford connectivity, and do it in a way that is that can be shared with others, and those others actually participate uh, in your self correction, because you are my best source of overcoming my bias, and I am your best source. And so all of that's bound up together, and we have separated them. And what I see in the Platonic tradition is something structurally analogous in the West to things I see in Buddhism and Taoism, where the cultivation of meaning and the cultivation of wisdom and the individual and communal aspects of that are all interwoven. We have separated it all out. We've separated meaning from wisdom. We've separated the individual from the collective. We've bereft them of any tradition. We've bereft them of any community, bereft them of any um, relevant role models. And in Platonism, I see a concern for the interweaving of wisdom and meaning. And I see the presentation of a spectacular role model, of course, in Socrates and other figures like Plotinus, but especially for me, Socrates. So for me, um, Plato is a continual source of an alternative way of understanding wisdom that I think addresses um, in these many ways, theory and also role modeling for us, that address, and they're written in dialogues, which conveys the communal dialogical aspect of wisdom and meaning. Plato is just this really wonderful presentation of of a legacy. It's not something outside of our cultural history, of a legacy alternative to the deficits and defects that are in our current model of meaning.
Amazing. Yeah. So I remember when I first met you, you gave a paper on how you use the dialogical method, right?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
As a kind of Socratic figure for people trying to, wrestle with themselves, with others, as you are trying to model and create communities that do this. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
I mean, it started with me alone in a room in front of a computer, and now it's grown into like a network of practice and courses, um, uh, um, and um, and and so its development has. I just want to acknowledge that many people have contributed to that. Christopher Master Pietro, Taylor Barrett, Rick Rapetti, Ryan Barton, Ethan Say. There's just been a whole bunch of people, so I just want to make clear about that. The basic idea um, is, I mean, we so I've been clear from the beginning, this is not an attempt to do, like, this is a claim that what we're doing is identical to what was happening at the time of Socrates. The evidence is too underdetermined, I think, to do that firsthand. And secondly, that culture is a very agonistic culture. It's a very aggressive. It's beset by war. There's a kind of overbearing militaristic masculinity running through it. And I don't think those aspects should transfer into the practice for most people, especially because I want people, I want men and women, to just put one point on it, to participate in. And the idea is, what we did is we set up a practice where we basically have four people, and one person is going to be the proposer. They're going to propose I'm putting this in scare quotes because this is a Socratic context, a definition of a virtue like honesty, and they're going to propose what it is. And then there's another person, the midwife. And the midwife, their job is not to ask interesting questions, but to ask interested questions. And the idea is this process of trying to draw them out, amplify. And and that involves noting, the midwife should be noting not only what the person is saying, but all the nonverbal ways in which they are trying to convey the meaning, the gesture, the metaphor, posture, timing, tempo, and using that to continually ask questions to draw them out, to draw the person out more and more and more. So it's just very much this eduction process. There's another person, this is the vibe, and what they're doing is they are just noting all the nonverbal rhythms and that are happening. They're just noting it down. They're picking up on the vibe, hence the name. Then there is the scribe. The scribe is writing down key, like, here's the original statement. Here was a key revision of the proposal. Here's another, and then here's the final form of the proposal. And then when it's done, the vibe and the scribe give the report to the midwife and and the proposer, and then the midwife does a degree of appreciation, which is, this is what I learned from you. This is what I heard. Uh, and then they do anticipation, and they say, but I feel like this was missing or this was off, right? And so right, I want to explore that missing or slightly. I want to modify your proposal, and then they become the proposer, and all the roles rotate. And what they're bound to is they have to build on the previous proposal. They cannot abandon it. They have to. So we talk about jazzing. You have to pick up and then modify it and then pass it on. And you go through one whole round. Now that's called dialect. We call that dialectic because we're trying to emphasize that has a method, it has a structure to it. Um, but you do all that on the virtue until all four people have proposed, and then you go into free speech. And the hope is, um, we like to compare it that the dialectic collects all the logs, but the spark has to catch fire. The logos has to show up of its own. And you go into free speech, and people just get into this free speech, very dialogical, usually a shared flow state of some kind around the virtue. And what happens is, because we tell them, you're not trying to give the right account of the virtue, you're trying to come into right relationship with it. And what happens is, when this is done, people will say things like, I never realized honesty was X. Honesty was this kind of reality. And they feel the beauty of it, and they feel deeply attracted. I was at a retreat not that long ago. We did a couple of rounds of, we call it DID, dialectic into dialogos. That's when the logos shows up and it takes on a life of its own. Did my mic just shift, or is it okay? No, it's okay. Um, so um, she came up to me and she said, I'm going to start cultivating virtue in my life. And I was like, okay, that's great. Now, we pick virtue for a very good reason. Uh, uh, and, as scholars, you may disagree with, but I largely have. I take the position that each virtue, the unity of the virtue, isn't that the unity of the virtues is not just that they are right. They belong to some system. I think of every virtue as the way in which you can be wise in a particular situation. So being wise in situation X is to be courageous, or to be wise in situation Y is to be honest. And perhaps it's a combination of virtues too. Um, and so that's how it's oriented to the love of wisdom. And secondly, a virtue, I would argue, properly understood, involves all the kinds of knowing. It involves propositional belief, it involves procedural skill, it involves perspectival states of consciousness, and it involves participatory traits of character. So it's a way of involving all these kinds of knowing. We like to talk about, how do we involve all of the person without making them self-involved? And so that structure is designed to give people a lived experience of the logos and of an anagoge within that logos, taking them into a virtue and the beauty of the virtue, kind of like in the symposium. So they start to be called to a deeper reality. That's one of the practices. We also have another one. Well, we have multiple ones. We have philosophical fellowship. We have the Socratic search space. We have the Socratic imaginal self-reflection. We have a whole bunch of these practices that are designed to try and bring out different aspects from the Platonic corpus and do something like a reverse engineering of them for our cultural and technological situation.
Yeah, no, I think of the Republic as you're talking. You're obviously hitting at the alignment of the entire soul, or the Callipolis,
Yeah, yeah,
in some such way, so that it's not, there's no ruler or master in the sense of the Stoic conception, or contemporary ideas about what Stoicism is, where it's
yeah,
control over, right? But in Platonism, it is this care of the self, right, so that you reflect, and this is in community, as you always say. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of it, because just the other day, I was telling somebody about the Alcibiades one and how if you want to know yourself, Socrates recommends to translate that into see yourself for the eye. And you can't do that in a mirror because a mirror is just a reflection of self, a la Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium, as opposed to how Socrates comes to interpret it, which is to see the divine in the eye of another, right? When that's reflected back to you, then you see what really is the self, right? And so this is, you've touched on it in a lot of your answers, but one of the things I find most refreshing about your practice and your understanding of the value of ancient wisdom traditions is this notion of virtue, right? And in the Republic, Socrates makes this beautiful distinction between the philosopher and the sight lover, right? The sight lover believes in beautiful things, but not beauty itself, versus the philosopher who believes both in beautiful things and also beauty itself. And the key is you have to believe in beauty itself, or virtue itself, or justice itself, something much like the circle, that we never have the appearance in its absolute perfect form. But it's like reaching for that perfect circle where we get the best wheel or the greatest architecture. We need to have that landmark, so to speak, in order to get us there. And so this is why I think, the belief in virtue, as you would, I think, argue, is absolutely essential to this process. Could you elaborate on what you think virtue is in an age where that word might ring weird for people? Like we've come to the age of the great darkness or abyss, where even that word means kind of nothing to people. How would you transform it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The first point I would bring out is something I've said, or at least implied, which is about the normativity and the interweaving of normativity and meaning. Which, I mean, to be fair, this point, Kant gets that in a way, and Hegel gets that in a way, but we have various proposals of trying to account for the normativity, and I think that has to do with ultimately with normativity around giving us access to truth and relevance and the relationship between truth and relevance. We can talk about that, but there's only about 4 or 5 proposals about where does that normativity come from. One is a Kantian notion, comes from sort of the intrinsic dynamics of the mind. I find that uh, uh, unacceptable, because it has a model of the mind as this, well, as Charles Taylor's calls, the buffered self, the isolated monological mind, which I think is just largely psychologically false for all of the reasons that come out of for ecog sci. Also, as Beeman and other people, he wrote the excellent book, Platonism and the Objects of Science. Nominalism actually doesn't support science, the idea that we project, because it can't account, and it has all kinds of sort of internal contradictions. Schelling noted this. Well, is my relationship to the mind itself also projection? And you get all these endless problems. So I find the nominalism, the Kantian proposal, the idea that our norms are somehow just generated socially, which is kind of the Hegelian procedure. I think there's truth in that, but I don't think it's sufficient truth. I think you can't account for some of the aspects of normativity. Why do people regard, like when people have mystical experiences and they have this experience of the really real, why does that have an ultimate normative standard for them? Right, which is what happens. They do this really interesting thing. Normally, when we diverge from our communal consensus state of mind, like we're drunk or we're dreaming, we come back and say, oh, that fails in comparison to this, and so it's less real. But people go into these experiences and they say, the communal consensus, right, it fails in comparison to this really real, and I'm going to change everything I do in my life and my identity and my character and my relationships because I want to be in conformity to this. And that fundamentals, I call that onto-normativity, the intrinsic goodness. There is a profound goodness to realness itself, which I think transcends a purely Hegelian proposal. Again, I'm not denying the Hegelian proposal that there's a communal participation, there's a communal aspect. I think that's important. I've emphasized it. But I think the only proposal that can really account for this is the Platonic proposal of normativity, which now, if that is the case, right, if there's something really real that grounds all our normativity, binds us to it, then virtue becomes not just a way of doing the right thing, it becomes the fundamental way of relating to what is most real, which is one of the primary things that is driving you in your quest for meaning. So I want to like that virtue is not just doing the right thing, it is a way of living the best possible life, of growing up. Listen to the language, facing up to what is most real, because that is at the core of what is driving you in meaning. In meaning, you want to be connected to something larger, where that's a metaphor for something more real that gives you orientation, gives you a basis for making comparative judgments about what is more and less real. That's what virtue is. It is our primary way of orienting and connecting and trying to find our way to what is most real. So it is not, and this may sound harsh in some ears, virtue is not just an ethical thing. It is a fundamental epistemological, ontological way of being that satisfies us. It gives us a fullness of being, and it gives us a flourishing way of being. And so that I guess was, I mean, I have a lot more to say to virtue, but that's where I would want to make the main point. Stop thinking of virtue. The word means like a power, something that affords possibilities. So I often pair virtue and virtuosity together because I think the pairing is closer to the ancient Greek than our modern notion, our modern word, I should say, um, virtue. And so I would emphasize that when we're talking about virtue, we're talking about how do you best relate to what is most real in a way that ramifies back through all of your judgments of meaning and connectedness. And I think that goes into truth, beauty, and goodness. But I've said enough. That's basically what I would say.
I think something we spoke about a little last time, this idea of receptivity or somehow opening oneself to this recognition of the presence of this virtue. But I think there's a number of characteristics of our age. There's one which I guess runs against what you've said in some sense, which is its kind of nominalist tendency. You know, if we think back to that great kind of division and debate around the existence of universals and the kind of Platonic ideas and the normative function of the good versus the relativistic conception of, you know, anything goes, with an iconoclastic tendency as well. So a kind of rejection of images, a kind of rejection of the saving of the appearances, to pick up on some of the things we spoke about. And I was just thinking today, just recently, I've been rereading C.S. Lewis, and you know, he has this really wonderful way. There's a collection of sermons he gave during the Second World War called "The Weight of Glory," and he talks about our inconsolable secret, this idea of there's a door that we can knock on, but we never do. But there's this sense, he says, I'll just read something briefly. He says, and he's kind of talking about the reluctance to accept or to take on the challenge or recognition of this presence. He says, there are always plenty of rivals to our work. We are always falling in love or quarrelling, looking for jobs or fearing to lose them, getting ill and recovering, following public affairs. If we let ourselves, we shall always be waiting for some distraction or other to end before we can really get down to our work. The only people who achieve much are those who want knowledge so badly that they seek it while the conditions are still unfavourable. Favourable conditions never come. And I guess what I'm thinking about here is what you're talking about is the kind of enactment or exemplification of virtue, which is not so much about, well, it is on some accounts a preparation or a learning or a kind of Sophianic journey in wisdom to recognize it. But it's also just a kind of doing, isn't it? On this other hand, it's a kind of just getting involved or doing something, a kind of an action. And I feel like we're at this point of kind of inaction, and you see this played out across all kinds of dimensions of culture, from the economic domain to aspects of the personal independence. So yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at here is this idea of how do we begin that step into that normative realm, when really sometimes it's just about sort of peering behind that curtain. It's not so much about having to go through the great drama of preparing for the theatre. It's some kind of glimpse. And I think what's interesting about your work and the way you speak about it is encouraging people to kind of see this in some way and find a way in. We're talking about many of these things on a kind of scholarly level in the realms of philosophy and poetry and so on. But it's something I recognize just in, you talk about that idea of the measure of virtue, where we say, yeah, that's what I should aspire to. And that might just be how you observe, someone playing with their child, or, the attitude somebody takes to their relationship to another person in the street. These are great things. These are icons of the highest goods, but they're made present in just the ordinary moments of the everyday, the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Yeah, I think about the idiotes, the particular, right? Because this is, follows from what I mean, this is the kind of question I wanted to ask too, which is the normative also means it's peculiar or distinct or unique, right? Strangely enough, this like strange paradox where, you think about Kierkegaard and, the Knight of Faith or Plotinus, and as John Dillon would say, that the sage might not actually help the old lady across the street, that Socrates doesn't seem virtuous in the way that we would expect in today's modern era of politeness and best practices. And so could you elaborate on like this kind of futility that Gareth, I think, was speaking to, that this virtue of inaction, or as Nietzsche might say, these small virtues that have become predominant in the culture that we live in now, of saying please and thank you ma'am and bless your heart, versus the kind of virtues that make you peculiar or distinct, or a C.S. Lewis, right? This kind of world.
That's an interesting question. So first of all, I what I would want to do is I'd want to pick up on something that Gareth was emphasizing, which is emphasized in the work I do and the work of people in the community I belong to, uh, which is this idea of enactment. Although I would put in all the E's, where it's enacted, it's embedded, it's extended, it's embodied, it's exapted, it evolves, it has an emotional compound. So this is the idea of a radical reconfiguration of the way we understand the mind, and perhaps we could get into that. But in the to your point, Gareth, cognition, there is no separation in this model from cognition and sensory motor doing. They're like our most lofty and most abstract thoughts are just so exaptation is the process by which you repurpose something. In biology, my favorite example is the tongue. The tongue evolved for one purpose, but in evolution, we repurposed it for speech. Lots of organisms have tongues, but they don't speak. Or if they're speaking to you, you're in trouble. So, um, but what we what well, a lot of us, Michael Anderson, taking just the vanguard on this, but increasingly we're getting good argument and evidence for, and this goes towards the imaginal as well, Gareth, is that even our most abstract thought, what we're doing is repurposing all that sensory motor orientation and all the sensory motor navigation. And this is why we use sensory metaphors. They're not just metaphors. when Plato's talking about noesis as the vision of the good, he's actually triggering, I would I would put it to you, if you're in the right frame of mind, he's triggering the visual machinery and repurposing it for doing something else. And your cerebellum is hungry to do that all the time. It's always trying to figure out how to repurpose things. Um, and so what that means is there is a deep continuum between our loftiest notions of whatever virtue, and then the particularity of the sensory motor engagement with a specific embeddedness in a specific environmental context. This is my way, by the way, of reading Aristotle's Sophia and Phronesis and their deep interconnectivity. And so that was one side of what not all of it, Gareth, but I was trying to pick up on that. Danny, towards your point, this to me is one of the central questions, or at least one of the ways that impacts on my work is it raises a question for me, which is this sort of issue. Many people have spiritual experiences and there's a continuum, and about 40% of the population has actually pretty anomalous powerful spiritual experiences. One of the problems of the meaning crisis is most people can't we don't have the wherewithal, the cultural cognitive framework or institutions or people to help them integrate that. But the question that often that I want to zero in on, which is why does somebody become a Socrates or a Siddhartha or a Plotinus or a Spinoza? Is that certain individuals seem to have these experiences, and rather than um, dismiss them or background them or let them just work in an intuitive way, they seem to take up what they seem to frame it as what L.A. Paul would call a transformative experience, which is they get what Agnes Callard would call they acquire or they take up. It's I don't know what the right verb is here, but they find themselves within an aspirational project of wanting to be radically somebody other than they are. This involves a radical kind of self transcendence that that I think is right at the core of Galen Strawson's paradox of self-transcendence, because this involves, again, right? You as the self you are can't actually self-transcend, but the self-transcendence nevertheless has to be who you are. You have to somehow become through an other that is you, who you are, even though you're not that yet. And we have, and so there's all of this. And for some people, that paradox is just like, and they turn away. And other people that was just weird and they turn away. But for some people, they take this up and then they take on the project of a radical kind of aspirational self-transcendence. Um, and they start to move towards a higher state of consciousness as their default mode of cognition. And where and when that becomes enlightenment, I don't think we should talk about enlightenment phenomenologically. I think we should talk about it functionally. I think certain individuals start to get to a higher state of consciousness and cognition and character and communication, all the C's, right, that afford them being reliable in helping us address perennial problems of meaning, not our specific day-to-day problems where can be satisfied with who we are and we can be polite and we can be moral and we can be ethical. This is Iris Murdoch's, the nice and the good, right? We have all these nice people, but we have to watch this one character, funnily enough, called John, who has an event, and he pivots and he realizes he suddenly acquires, I want to be a good person, not just a nice person. And this, so I think that's the philosophical import. The scientific interest in me is, okay, but what are the conditions within and without and between that afford people making that turn? And this is the Alcibiades problem in Plato. You have everybody, you have somebody who has everything that they need. They're brilliant, they're beautiful, they're wealthy, they're charismatic, they're bright, and they love Socrates and they hang around with him, and yet he becomes a supervillain. And so what is it that makes people pivot such that they move beyond being nice and they start to aspire to becoming good. They start to take on the project of, and I think this is an essential feature of somebody that we deem good, and right, is that they start to acquire the virtues and the virtuosity for reliably helping to ameliorate perennial problems of self-deception, self-destruction, right? Absurdity, alien, all the things that beset humanity and undermine our need for meaning, thwart it, frustrate it. That's and so I've given you an answer, but it turns into a question, a proper scientific question. And I think it has philosophical import. Like what, and I don't think we can. I mean, intuitions are welcome, but I don't think we can satisfy this just a priori. Like we need to do like what makes that difference? And part of the proposal, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient, is to create communal practices like dialectic and dialogos, Socratic search-based philosophical fellowship, because that logos of our collective intelligence can be a pivot, a pivoting power. It can make people pivot when they taste it and they live within it.
So you just hit on an image that has haunted me ever since I really got into the Platonic world, which is Alcibiades, the so-called failed student, because he becomes this lecherous, awful tyrant who uses his charm, his rhetoric, his beauty, his wealth to destroy the city that brought him up. As Socrates would refer to the city, the mother, of his own being, and in the Republic, again, to bring it back to there, Socrates basically describes Alcibiades' situation, right? Where, in a city bereft of virtue, this democratic city that where all pleasures and all desires, it's whatever you want because everything is relative, that it's almost impossible for the philosopher to be born. And if they are, yeah, then what's going to happen is one of two things. Either they're going to be useless to the city and the city's going to ignore them, a la Socrates, in some such way. And they're going to be a prattler, so to speak, or it's dangerous, right? It can lead to this tyrannical life. And so part of me, sometimes when we think about like, how is it possible that Alcibiades had everything set up for him to become the next, great it boy in the world of philosophy, but then chose the tyrannical life instead. It does seem like an adventure, and I do think somebody should write the movie for this, for Alcibiades.
He has a great death scene, eh? You're running naked out of a burning house carrying a sword. Like, come on, that cries out for a movie, right? Yeah.
It's screamy. Like, I mean, come on, having an affair with the Queen of Sparta, possibly all those other anecdotes about his sister and mother. But in any case, the point is that what if Alcibiades is not a failed student? But one of the things about philosophy is that it can and has been a abandoned bride that gets picked up by the kind of demiurgos, as is in the Republic, this bald tinkering one that just got out of jail, that can be picked up by people and actually understood. They see what can happen when you believe in the good, the true, and the just. But they also see that the masses, all they need to do is be manipulated, and so that they wield this power for this particular end, which is to continue to gain more and more power, not because they misunderstood the value of the philosophical life, but because they both know and so think of book 1 in the Republic when Socrates says that the philosopher will both know what the good is and what justice is, but also not
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean will also be able to twist it, right? There'll also be a kind of Odysseus or thief, and so yeah, I'm just asking, like, is that possible that all of these methods that lead to this? And I like the fact that you don't want to use the word enlightenment, but they can lead to this epiphanic embodied way of life can also be used for negative purposes.
Well, I think I mean that's first of all, I want to be clear that that's a core theme. I think it exacerbates the problem, but let me respond to your excellent question. One of my core arguments And this is where there's a Buddhist influence. This is sort of my take on the First Noble Truth. The very processes that make us so adaptive are anticipatory, attuning, relevance realization that make us so powerfully adaptive and give us the general intelligence that is far beyond anything that the LLMs have or whatever. Right? Those very processes also make us perpetually prone to self-deception. There is no way to excise, right? There is no way to excise the adaptivity away from the proclivity for self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. Um, and that's what makes wisdom, I mean, obviously, but it's what makes wisdom challenging because you somehow have to ameliorate. You can't just shut off your anticipatory, right, attuning relevance realization because you're dead within a day. In fact, you couldn't even leave the room you're in because you'd just be overwhelmed by emotion, the amount of information available to you. Um, so you somehow have to ameliorate the self-deception without monkeying too much with the equipment so that you don't lose all its adaptive connectedness. And I think that's a very I think that's a very fine. I Pascal's term comes to mind. I think that requires ongoing finesse. It's not, you can't just go in and engineer. You're constantly finessing this. And I think without an appropriately a role model, that won't work. Now, and this is connects to your point. I'm not denying in any way context, but I do think that, again, I'm not claiming this is sufficient. I want to be really cautious around this point because I take this to be a really hard problem. But I'm coming increasingly, and other people are, I'm coming increasingly to think that the idea, not of Buddhist, but of psychological attachment, are attachment structures, which are so predictive of all of our relationships, might be the key issue here. That what's going on is we've noted all of, and again, Danny, I want to acknowledge Alcibiades seeing an opportunity. That's what I mean. You can reframe these things really powerfully. He also suffers for that really profoundly. Um, but but I want to say, yeah, but I also think that what's at issue here is the attachment structure. Um, Alcibiades behaves like somebody who has an avoidant attachment style, very, very strongly. Plato seems to have a secure attachment style, and he seems to be able to take Socrates up in the way that will impact not just his machinations and his plans, but actually his ability to connect to other people. Uh, and again, all of you, I'm not claiming this is sufficient. I want to be really clear about that. But I think something that can make a difference is if I am presented with wisdom and I have the capacity for secure attachment to the role models that will then bleed out into my relationship to other people, I am much less likely to view them as the masses that I should merely manipulate. Uh, so typically, securely attached people don't behave that way because they are able to enter, they have a basic attitude of being able to connect to other human beings. Anxious, avoidant, disorganized people are like in serious deficit around that, and therefore, like it's always underdetermined. We don't have enough text, but if you ask me to guess, he's got an avoidant attachment style, Alcibiades, and it, it fits the case because the avoidant person can often be very charming and charismatic and attractive, and they attract people that have an anxious attachment style that becomes sycophantically related to them. In fact, this is a very powerful common problem, and so that's what I would want to put into the mix.
Yeah, I had a vision one time about this, and I think we have a lower soul. I think Jaak Panksepp has a really good model of these circuits that mammals have. I think um, Gibson's like myth of the given is really important. Like we are an active being, and like they can take over our I've heard you say this before, John, like our seat of consciousness,
Yeah.
these little imps or whatever. And there's a lot of therapy to work with parts. And there's I know in your Neoplatonic course that you taught during COVID, you had this like 23 step
Yeah.
depth process at the end that I've done, and I've seen symbols emerge from the work, and I've on lesser degrees just had like a I could go this way or that way, and I don't like how I'm showing up. And I just sat in the woods. I'd have a thought, I'd feel into it, I'd reject it, I'd have another thought, I'd feel into it, I'd feel a little better, and I would do that, and I'd have an aporia. And then I also do the social cognition part where I go, I don't know enough. Can I find a friend that can just listen to me and then reflect back and give me some insight? And I think the two of those have allowed me so much growth that it's profound. Because if we have something in our past, and correct me, but if we have something in our past we just never grew up from, and it just sits around there, it gets backgrounded, but then it just takes over and ruins things. Whereas if we can actually acknowledge it, and this is like prosos, this is attention, this is not episteme, this is like you give it attention, and you can disentangle the complex from the true self, and then reintegrate in a mindful way. It's amazing the growth you have. You don't need this big fancy model. You just need this kind of practice and wisdom and stuff. And you know, Alcibiades, I'd say, is very conscious and very unconscious, and he can notice Sophia but not really participate in her in some ways. And whereas Socrates, and DC Schindler says this beautifully, he kind of becomes the symbol. Jesus Christ becomes the symbol, right? People actually can participate in Sophia through them, and it's awkward and painful sometimes, but there that's where like the electric self-transcendence can kind of happen, either slowly or, you know, and it's a bottomless thing. I can get really successful and then all of a sudden not be successful, and if I stop self-reflecting, I'm back in the cave. I'm another prisoner in the cave. And so it's really, Thoreau says, you know, it takes a lifetime to learn how to live. And I think it sounds poetic, but it's also kind of wise.
Well, I want to make a connection to that because it actually, I think, deeply connects to the attachment model I was talking about. So you're talking about mindfulness, and Siegel has the very good, I think, theory, Daniel Siegel, that we do not come with an ability to reflect or even to introspect. If you ask a 3.5-year-old what's in their head, they'll say blood, right? Right. So, but they're aware of other people's mental states much earlier, probably as early as 18 months or even earlier. Um, so what that means is what we do is he calls it mindsight. I get an ability to see into Danny's mind to some degree, and then I adjust how I'm presenting myself so she can get me better, so that she can see better into my mind, and then she starts to adjust, and we get what he calls mindsight resonance. And then he said his argument is, and he says human connections make neural connections, and neural connections make human connections. And then what we do is we turn that on ourself. I think that's what we're doing in mindfulness. So mindfulness is already an inherently social, dialogical practice, although we tend to think of it as a monologic shining of our own light. And first of all, I want to challenge that. I know, Rob, you're not saying that, but I'm just saying I want to challenge that Western understanding of mindfulness. Secondly, that whole mindset resonance is dependent on attachment processes, right? If we're trying to do that and I'm avoidant and she's anxious, right? The mindset resonance is going to go off in all kinds of parasitic ways that are then going to get internalized into my attempts at mindfulness. And so I'm agreeing what you're saying, but Rob, I've talked to you. Hang out with you. You tend to have a pretty secure attachment. Like you're very capable of entering into relationships. You're not overly needy. You're not anxious about people.
But I wasn't in a really deep way recently, not to get into my psychology or whatever. But I realized it, and I did not like how I was showing up in little ways, and I sought wisdom, and it's already changed. So I agree, but
Yeah, but let's play with that, because what I wanted to say is, and I think that if that's the case for you, I'm glad to hear that. By the way, you're a friend, and I want you to flourish. But the other thing is, all the evidence points to you can do a lot of important work on your own if you don't have a secure attachment. But the ultimate thing you have to do is enter into relationship with people that have secure attachment, or at least are showing up in the practice with a style of secure attachment. So I think you also started doing a lot of practices. You started to form some stable relationship with people. Not me. I'm overcoming an anxious attachment style. But right, you've met a lot of people that I think have secure attachment, and I think that what I'm saying is that also was taught, and that comes into why you didn't like it. I mean, that's the thing.
Well, that's why I think the mimetic aspect of Plato is really interesting, because I was
Yeah.
talking to our friend Robert Breedlove recently,
Oh
and
yeah.
being around him and his wife was so soulful. We weren't
Yeah.
articulating how awesome is that, but this mimetic, mammalian embodied experience was like into me. It was
Yeah.
so profound, and it was like I was so happy. That's like why I really love all of you. I find it so profound to be around people that care about their kids and want to let them in the front door, and that care about their time and want to surround themselves with great books and
Yeah.
great poetry.
Yeah.
And it's like you can have it up here at this propositional, I'm so smart, I'm doing smart things, but this mimetic, embodied, experienced, phenomenological thing ripples up into the
I was
consciousness.
thinking there of this kind of idea. I mean, the way you even just visualized it with that gesture, Rob, of this kind of eruption, isn't it? And it's in a sense what we might mean by something like a ecstatic experience of sorts, or a kind of form of revelation, or even mystical experience. And I was just thinking, even just of the title that we've taken for this series, the ladder, as this image of that encapsulates so many of these things in a sense, because it's about, as you say, that idea that one can climb, but then feel oneself sink back down, but that there's a sort of upward, downward, continual reciprocity between, our striving or movement upward, which doesn't have to come from those higher places, as you say. It can come out of those kind of everyday regions of our activity, but also how that then opens up to a kind of receptivity or a kind of grace. Now, I mean, there's some really beautiful writing on this from Edith Stein. And yeah, she talks about this. I was thinking back to something John was saying earlier, but she talks about this idea that, prayer is a kind of Jacob's ladder, but that in it, there's a sort of set of levels where she says you reach a state where it's possible for a transformation of the whole person. So it is this kind of process of embodied prayer and action which leads to this reciprocal. And this is where I come back to your response to my point earlier, John, about the kind of integration of the, let's say, intellectual and kind of sensory aspects of our nature, and how the one can lead to the transformation of the other. It's something I've found of profound significance in the many years I've been involved in the arts, whether that's music or visual arts or performance or painting, any of those kinds of disciplines. And it's why those things are really the foundations of all kinds of traditional cultures structurally. And to some extent, I suppose that's something we've partly lost connection to, in terms of our habituation to a set of collective representations or practices, the kind of alienation of community, or the slightly fractured social relations that technology can, on the one hand, kind of instantiate and amplify, but on the other hand, create new sorts of connections as well. This is, I think, thinking about some of the work that Danny's doing with the Cora project as well. I think it's a part of a mission to kind of reimagine or reframe how we approach this through this kind of medium as well. And yeah, even in this kind of work, even in these kinds of conversations, it's about kind of instantiating that as a practice and building other kinds of networks and other kinds of ways of communicating those ideas. Um, because I might go away from this moment and take a walk in the field across the street from me here and just observe a bird of prey and take in a moment of beauty and reflect that back into what we've spoken about, and then that kind of comes into a gesture then I make to my son later, and this kind of accumulative process builds out from those moments.
Gareth, I think that's really important, especially up and down the ladder. Both DC Schindler and Mark Wynn uh, talk about, yeah, but it's not just up. What happens when you go back down into the cave? Um, uh, and for me, this has been a big chunk of my recent work, and it goes to things like art and seeing the beautiful bird in flight, which is this idea of the recovery of the spiritual senses. The argument is basically, well, I, there's a very technical argument I just published in philosophical psychology, but I'll give you the gist of it. It's built on what we've talked about. Like when I'm engaged in insight, like that is an exaptation of my sight processes, right? And when I'm hearing the call of the good, that is I'm that's my, and we use language of resonance. This is a hearing, right? We're repurposing, and we're in contact with reality, touch, which whenever I'm touching, I'm being touched. As whenever I'm realizing, I'm being realized. Like, and you see this in Origin, right? I mean, it probably goes back into the Platonic corpus. I think it does, because it'd be very odd that it just sort of came to the fore with him out of nowhere. I mean, maybe the guy was kind of brilliant, but this
No,
idea,
it's all over the Platonic corpus. I mean, it's
right?
particularly the Parmenides, right? And so just yeah.
Yeah, good. So great. And Wynne talks about this in his masterpiece, Renewing the Senses, and he's giving largely a phenomenological account of this. But I've been making an argument that what happens is we not only go up, but we come down, and we can re-exapt and repurpose. Um, and Wynn's point is, when this happens, it's not that you start seeing focal objects. So he was looking at people who go through fundamental religious conversions, building on William James's work. And they don't, like, when they say they see God, they don't see a focal object. It's not adjectival, it's adverbial. They see everything differently. For example, the reality goes from being a universe, a box in which things are contained, to being a face in which the whole is present in every part, and the whole is mysteriously more than any of the parts can convey. And so you get this fundamental reorientation of how you're using your senses, how you're seeing, how you're hearing, how you're touching, and this enlivening of the spiritual senses. I think it's also something. I mean, both Wynne and obviously D.C. Schindler, David, are deeply influenced by Platonism, and they use the anagogic, ascent and return as their primary mythos for addressing how should we be understanding these kinds of fundamental transformation. And so, this is where Douglas Headley and I have a lot of overlap. This idea that we can seriously play with, right, that up and down in imaginal practices, so that we can draw out the spiritual senses, so that this doesn't remain abstract ivy tower theoretical ideas. This goes into the very ways in which I'm seeing and feeling and being in the world. And so that's, sorry, I'll be quiet, but that's exactly.
One of the things that I love about the last, well, let me put it this way. There are resistant philosophies to the philosophy of this, ivory tower transcendent, as if Plato created this world that we escape to. And of course, one of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche, contributed to this conception of thinking of it that way. But I think it's because he was fighting a problematic version of Platonism that exists in his time, and that he was a very clever Matus-like kind of embodied philosopher. But one of the things that I love about him is, and I think you would agree, is that nature, this body, right? Like it's creating, right? Like nature is evolving into, life, and then life overcomes that, and power, and then beyond power, spirit. And that when we these words, these that come out of our mouth, they come from this body, right? They come from all of the various different synapses moving, and unpredictable and infinitely beautiful ways, so as to give birth to this more than, right? And so these extrasensory, not extrasensory, but these super sensory, if you will, spiritual ways of touch or hearing or sight. Like it's not like they're not superpowers from like outside of this world, right? Like no, this is nature's becoming. This is Platonism in the earth. This is the human body that evolves into the more than, versus a kind of, yeah, disconnected manna from heaven, kind of just gets thrown at you, versus no, the reason why it's a ladder, the reason why it's an up and down, is it is this holding in tension these two growing realities, or at least I would argue, because that's what nature is. I mean, and so I want to end on your conception of nature and the connection. Yeah, what do you think nature is, and why does it support your
Yeah.
understanding? Uh,
Yeah, well, this is excellent. I mean, this is maybe the third domain of reasons for why I consider myself a Neoplatonist, which is a powerful consideration well, I mean, there's a bunch of things that have been happening. Um, uh, First of all, our relation to nature is gone from being I'm in here and I'm somehow getting postcards inside my inner chamber and I'm arranging them, and hopefully the arrangement will be right to somehow correspond the world, even though I could never know that it could correspond because I'd have to be outside looking, and all that sort of disaster, which gives us endless threats of solipsism and skepticism. So my response to that is to treat it into a modus tollens. That means this fundamental premises are just fundamentally wrong. And this is a view shared increasingly in 4 Ecog Sci. So to put it in a phrase, right, the representational theory of knowing has been, with all of its dichotomies, has been dissolving back into the conformity theory of knowing, in which to know something is for you and that known thing to participate in each other in a profound, mutually shaping fashion. Hence all my work on participatory knowing, perspectival knowing, etc. And Catherine Pickstock, her Aspects of Truth is just, I think, the central book around this. And once you start thinking about that way, you then think, okay, and what do I? Well, that's really interesting, because if we're participating, that means there's some sort of shared grammar between cognition and reality. Um, um, and what we have is cognition is bottom up, top down in this. It's leveled, but it's not. It's a continuum, like we've been talking about here, all the way up and all the way down, right? And then and now what we're getting is, no, well, Alicia Uraro and Terence Deacon and Eric Hole and Michael Levin. We have to think of reality as a continuum. We can analytically sever out levels that we need to talk about, but each one of these levels, I mean, Hole's got like a pretty much almost like a mathematical proof, right? That each level is right, has unique causal powers and informational access powers, each level. So you have a continuum that is irreducible all the way through. That's what reality is like, right? You have Paz, I'm going to be talking to him, and Matt Segal, he's the physicist, arguing the book is entitled The One, because we need to bring back this notion. Uh, uh, um, so I'm seeing these two grammars as participating in the same principles, the same patterns, the same processes, and they're in conformity with each other. There's niche construction at every level of our being. What does that mean for me? And that goes to the arguments that Pickstock has developed, and Putnam and Quine and myself and others, which is all the dichotomy. So modernity said, oh, this vertical, that's so absurd, the natural and the supernatural. How can communication and causation go that way? But what we have is we have an equally absurd horizontal set of dichotomies between the subjective and the objective, the value and the fact, the meaning and the measurement, the theory and the data. All of those are dissolving. Well, anyways, it's a continuum up, it's a continuum, right? Up, bottom up, top down, continuum in and out, and the continuum between. And so you have what my good friend William Desmond, one of my heroes, and I get to form a relationship with him. We've got this. I mean, this is the image the Platonists use. We have this spherical porosity that it, and I think that actually demonstrates the fundamental nature of nature. And let me push a little bit further on that. When you get rid of those dichotomies, and this is the work of James Filler, you're undermining a substance ontology and you're moving to a relational ontology. But then Alayanaris and Desmond, like, and I did this with James. Yeah, James, I get all the arguments showing you can't get relations out of substances. Yeah, but you also can't get relata out of the relation. And went, oh no. And then what you get in Yanaris and Desmond is, well, it's communal. In the same way in which you can't have persons without communities and communities without persons, this non-duality is the mother of both the relations and the relata in this spherical continuum. That's how I think of nature. It is incredibly rich. It is combinatorially explosive. It is deeply, powerfully creative. I could say more, and we deeply participate in it, and it participates in us.
So that here, like one of the amazing things about Platonism is that the problem of Platonism is not the problem of participation, which so many people think it is, right? Like, how do we get to the forms? No, for Plato, that's a brute fact. That's a necessity, right? Like that's the jumping off point. For him, I think the big problem throughout the corpus is the exact one that you are working on too, which is the problem of the Alcibiades. How can you have all these resources at your fingertips? The problem of deception. That's why the sophist is what it is. It ends on this idea of like, how do you tell the difference between the sophist and the philosopher? How do you tell the difference between the false image maker and the true? So book 10 of the Republic is about not bad poetry, like, oh, all poetry is bad, but no, about a kind of image making that is merely living the life of making copies after copies after copies, because that's what leads to the age of meaninglessness, is when we're all just thinking everything is a lie, so I might as well just copy. So no, I am in deep fundamental agreement with you that like Owen Barfield as Gareth would probably reference, that like participation is a brute fact, and the fact that we get all mired about that, like, no, we are in relation to everything, with ourselves, the person in front of us, to the divine or cosmic in our souls, because it constitutes the very nature of naturing. And so
And I think I mean I describe myself as a post-nihilist Neoplatonist. I owe a debt of gratitude to the postmodernists, because I mean I have criticisms of them as individual thinkers and individual arguments, but this idea, one of the critique of the binaries was basically the horizontal dichotomies of modernity are just as absurd as the medieval dichotomy that modernity defined itself by rejecting. And so you have this performative contradiction at the heart of modernity. And if you don't address it, you fall into nihilism. And I think that's fundamentally right. And if you pass through that, you come out at the other side where you say, okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna like deconstruct, and I'm using that technically, right? All of the fabric of modernity, and then what I'm going to do, and this is William Desmond, that's what he does, right? It's like, and then I'm going to return to the phenomenology of intelligibility, and then see what I can actually realize. And the fact that this is convergent, this great cutting edge philosophy, with all this amazing biology and physics and cognitive science, I think I was talking to Adam Walker, the guy who does verse, the close reading of poetry. I think we're on the edge of another Renaissance. I call it the advent of the sacred. And he pointed out to me, he said, well, yeah, and all of the Renaissances are always prefigured by a resurgence in Platonism and Neoplatonism.
no, I've been saying it to my students since, I don't know, goodness, 2009. So probably not as long as you have, but it's just one of those weird, you study history long enough, you see this pattern, right?
That's right. And yeah, he's excellent.
He's bringing back poetry not as entertainment, but as a process of imaginal education for attainment.
No, I'm very blessed to have been in one of these classes when I was a master's.
I really like Adam a lot. You know, I'm
Oh,
increasingly.
no, I was thinking Desmond. Sorry.
Desmond is fantastic too, but I was Adam, his work on poetry.
Mm,
As I've shifted more and more to, and I've been trying to encourage other people like Mike Levin. Mike, you're a Platonist. Just admit it. Put your cards on the table. And now he is, which is good. But as I've become more and more explicit about this, it has afforded me meeting people, not necessarily even in the Platonic tradition, although it's done that, but it's afforded me being able to meet people like Nicole Bodden from the Zen tradition and get an Adam and get this sense. It's hard to describe. Maybe it's a bit about what Wynn is talking about. This ability to sense a kind of presence in people, and some of it is very profound. When I was on the Philosophical Silk Road in Rome with Bishop Maximus, he was already a close friend. Um, I had we both shared that we had some sort of mutually transformative relationship, and he was very he's wonderful. He said, "You know, I don't know how to process this because you're not a Christian, but I found a category for you in Clement of Alexandria. God is with you." And I went, "Okay, that's great, thank you." But what happened for me is like I think he's going to be a saint. I think he'll be officially elected. Like there's there's a way in which he telescopes theosis to me. There's a way in which people presence above and beyond what they're saying. It's kind of like the Zen idea of direct transmission. I see it also in the Nicole Baden, and more and more people. I'm being gifted with coming into meeting these people that radiate in this way. That that I happen to think the only argument for, I call it the spiritual maturation argument. If the child is to the adult is to the sage is to the sacred. I think our own, right, and we are constantly being called beyond what makes sense to us. And I think, therefore, the only way in which we can get a sense of the sacred that actually affords our transformation is to encounter uh, people who are present in it. I think that's the only argument for God that I find tenable or plausible. I think there are good philosophical, ontological arguments for the one, but I'm talking about more like this sense of it being that which enters into people's lives in a deeply transformative, personal way. And so uh, that was unforeseen by me, that this gift, like that more and more people shining with this. And that gives me hope because the meaning crisis and the meta crisis are spinning us into a lot of darkness right now. So I'm sorry,
well,
I'm just on.
no, so I hope you know that I think we should stop on that note because you're one of those people saturated with this radiation, right? Like this shimmering, like, and so I hope you know that you are inspiring people to light and see the light of their own flame, as Plato would have said in the seventh letter, that the spark leaps into another, and you are definitely passing that torch on. So with that particular idea, Gareth, you always have some way of beautifully wrapping things up that my awkward self does not. So,
Well, thank you. I thought I'd come back to the Lewis quote that I alluded to earlier. And actually, I think fittingly and maybe touchingly, it relates to John's remark there about, our kind of personal encounter with the good or the one, and whether we want to call that God or whether we want to call it virtue. I think it speaks to that sense in which it touches us as persons. So he says, the sense that in this universe we are treated as strangers, the longing to be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality, is part of our inconsolable secret. And surely from this point of view, the promise of glory becomes highly relevant to our deep desire. For glory means good rapport with God, acceptance by God, response, acknowledgement, and a welcome into the heart of things. The door on which we've been knocking all our lives will open at last.
Tohen.
So beautiful, right? Like, yeah, that's going to be written on my heart from now on, this inconsolable secret.
But I think, yeah, you know, we've spoken about how this beauty is a kind of consolation, and this is something we touched on with Emerson, and I think, you know, we can see that even in the measure and wealth of this conversation, you know, that we come away from these encounters immeasurably better than we were an hour ago, you know, with some deepened sense of our self, with that idea that you said, John, of how we've shaped ourselves in this conversation. We've come into this new interrelationship. We've moved around into each other's minds and understandings. And that, I think, in itself is some consolation or promise that we can, you know, step beyond ourselves, and that we're not alienated and alone, and that there is some sense that we can reach out over that divide that we've erected between ourselves and others.
That is one of my defining criteria for Dialogos, when all participants say, I couldn't have got here on my own.
John, I hope you don't mind if I ask you to come back soon.
I will come back. I will come back. I believe strongly in your project, and
Thank you, John. I believe in yours too. It's so amazing. So many different new innovations with regards to thinking about the human being, what therapein is, or therapy, that it's more than just, you know, self-healing in the sense of your modern MP version of that, but something uplifting, transcending, embodied, rooted, and something for everyone, regardless of what state of ascent or descent you're in.
it's been a great pleasure being here, and I'm more than happy to come back again.
Oh dear diorama,